Ah, how did this get here? Hello, everyone. This is Jimmy Coldest back again with another logic tutorial. I'm gonna go ahead and set some puppet presets like I always do. They're not really super important. But today we're going to be talking about this thing, the controller sensor, and all of the wonderful things it can do. How it can control inputs and outputs and all that good stuff. Now, one thing you'll see right away opening it up with L1 and square is all these, various buttons on the controller that connect things. It also has an array of camera settings which you can mess around with. I would highly advise delving into these. Platforming shadow, lots of good stuff. Which helps if you want to see, your shadow. Gonna go ahead and set minimum jump height to 100%. And let's talk about a few of the other things. First off, you can see the wires leading out of this thing if you want to know what all this different stuff does. The health meter connects to die, which basically just resets the puppet. And when you have this setting in here is dead, you can connect it to the respawn input, allowing you to respawn. Simple, in case you ever accidentally delete these wires. There's also this, which detects when your puppet is possessed or not. And I'm going to go ahead and set this to forced possession, which if you've ever wondered, how do I make it so the player is just in the puppet from the very beginning? Well, forced possession is that methodology. And circle usually depossesses the puppet, but I delete that a lot of times because you don't actually want the puppet to be depossessed. You can also see directly how your controls interact with the puppet interface. X for jump, motion sensor movement connected to lean, and the left stick added to walk. So that's, stuff you can mess around with. But now that we've gone through the basics, I think I'll go ahead and, get into some more tricky stuff, which is inputs. Generally, when you're building any kind of logic or puppet, I highly advise that you make a set of inputs. And if you want to label them properly, just do this. If you want a full glossary of all the different things, you can make all the different icons using only text. The In Dreams website has a section called Icons, which can help you out with this. Just gonna go through all the basic inputs. I go down the entire line of things I think I'm gonna need. The primary buttons, as it were. L1, R1, such as that. All the things that are necessary. Be sure to color code them too. And of course R2. Speaking of R2, I have some useful information if you've been using R2 or L2 to trigger any movements in your games or whatnot. Some of you might be a bit confused. And let's go ahead and color code them a little bit. But to get to that, you may notice that sometimes when you need to trigger something, it doesn't quite trigger properly with R2. A good example is if I wanted the puppet to strike a pose. Let's go ahead and test this out real quick. We'll connect L1 or R2. We might as well connect all of these right away since we're going to be using them later. L1, R1, triangle, square, circle, and X. Alright, so we'll use R2 as an example. You'll notice that R2, it kind of like, you can kind of like pressure down your thumb and do it halfway. You know, it's not quite, kind of go in between half strength, which is nice if you really want this to be an option. But sometimes when you're trying to use it for inputs, like if you want to have an attack linked up to that, it's unresponsive. And you may be asking, how can I get it to be entirely responsive so that when you just tap R2, you know, the sensitivity is set so that it does the move that you want and you don't have to press down on it real hard? Well, calculators are what you use. A thing called greater than, then you go into operand 2 and you set it to 0.2, something really low, something very sensitive, and basically it'll work fine that way. Let's go ahead and give it a little test. It makes the input super sensitive. Oh, we don't want that, we want this. As you can see here, it's working as intended. So if you want to know how to convert L2 and R2, just be my guest with the calculator. You can even make it so that you don't have to apply much pressure to get him to strike a pose or use a move or whatever else it is you want him to do. Like there's no half measures once you hook up the calculator. Kind of looks like he's passing a letter to someone. Anyway. Yeah, so I would go ahead and hook these up. They're going to be useful. And a lot of Dreams is about limiting these inputs, like say you want to pull off a move or whatever. Or whatever. I tend to do it this way. This logic is not entirely necessary all the time, but this is how I prefer to do it. Just put a switch down, and this will prevent playback on the timeline. We're going to use circle as an example. And we're going to make it a simple move. Set it to linear blend. Personally, you're a lot better off using the action recorder. But I'm in a hurry, so... well, maybe we'll use the action recorder anyway. Stamp it out, press keyframe mode, and just slightly nudge these things. Just nudge them a little bit so that they're you know, just a little affected. Don't want to do it too much. The reason why you want to nudge them a bit, because you'll have this issue where you consider certain things primary and they move funky and it's kind of difficult to control. Anyway, we're going to move it ahead and we're going to do a little move real quick. Turn this off. This is a power move, let me tell you. Might want to make them short, because it is an attack, I assume. The wind-up should be long, though. Alright, that's good. Now we're just going to copy the beginning so that he resets to his previous position. Double tap, make sure they're all on smoothing. Make it a little bit faster. This isn't a tutorial on moves, I'm just trying to prove a basic premise. We will want to shut off his procedural animations because his feet are moving and those are going to be affected, so let's go ahead and shut this off. Oops. It's on the timeline, didn't want that. Put it outside the timeline. Or you could reverse scene, but you gotta make sure that the playhead just isn't over there. Another thing you generally want to do is shut off the puppet interface. If you shut this thing off, the puppet cannot be moved or jump or do any of that stuff. So keep that in mind if ever you want to limit the puppet's ability to move. And we're going to use, oh yeah, circle. There's our move. But what I wanted to talk about is the fact that if you have multiple moves, like, say you got one up here, we're going to mess it up a little bit so that it kind of like does something different. Oops. Let's use these. I think we're having some kind of trouble, probably because our age-old enemy, you know, the timeline. But we're just going to make this move real quick. This really stupendous move. And you're probably wondering, like, if I press circle and then triangle, it will play both moves. How do I limit this from happening? Well, there's one way, which is you could connect these wires to their opposite, you know, NOT gates. But that would run up your wires. You'd have a lot more wires. It's a lot simple. You know, a lot simpler to just shut off these inputs, and that's why I made this chip separate in the first place. And occasionally, you know, your moves are usually not going to be inside the chip. They're usually going to... Let me select this properly. They're usually going to be outside the chip, preferably in their own little microchips, you know, for each attack. Like so, or whatever it may be. It doesn't necessarily have to be an attack, it could just be some kind of method of progressing through the game. But yeah, usually they're separate, so what you could do is you could turn this off. You know, you could turn off these individual inputs if you want to have the ability to use certain ones and not other ones, like if you want to string together a combo or something. Or you could just turn off the entire chip altogether, and that means nothing's going to prevent you from using this move. And it will also shut off the input that you currently have active, meaning you can't, you know, overdo it. But the other method also works. We just shut off one input, or all of the above, you know, whatever is necessary. So that's just a little, you know, something about inputs and how they control. I'm also going to go over how much stuff you have access to. There's the left stick and the right stick, which is different from left stick local and right stick local, which basically are oriented based off the camera and whichever way it's facing, so that could be pretty useful to mess around with. You have all the D-pad inputs, plus the general D-pad, which honestly, you can make this work for you, but I never use it. I kind of think it sucks. That's just me. There's the touchpad, which, you know, everybody knows about the touchpad. There's L3 and R3, usually used as sprint buttons in most games, depending. And there's these, enter and exit. Don't really use those too much. Then there's the camera settings, like say you want your camera to be really far out from the puppet, just move it out. Say you want it to be really close, just move it in. And that's an easy way of controlling, you know, that factor. There's also camera height, which honestly doesn't change much. I'm assuming this is supposed to do something. I mean, I guess it changed some things. Maybe if I set it really high, it'll change something. Yeah, it does change. It just doesn't change very much. I will say that if you're ever having glitches with the camera height, your collision actually affects the camera. Like, if you set this really low or really high, it's going to affect the camera. See, like, notice this? Kind of move the camera a little bit. So keep that in mind, you know, if you're ever messing around with that. Let's see what it would be like if it was really high. Like, check that out. Like, that affects the camera 100%. So, yeah, keep that in mind if you're ever, like, working with the camera. Just, the collision is a factor. There's also a bunch of other useful doodads. Not in there, in here. There's field of view. This will make distant objects, you know, fuzzy. We'll give you an example. Oh, wait a minute. Field of view might just affect, you know, what you can see. I think it's field of view is like how wide your field of vision is. It's kind of weird and trippy, honestly. It's aperture that makes distant objects, you know, fuzz out and such. It's basically like automatic focus. It can create some neat effects. I would definitely advise aperture now and then if you want to like have some nice vistas. There's VR scale, don't know nothing about that, don't use VR, so sorry, can't tell you much about that. There's sideways offset. I think this would be used for third person. It's basically just this. I like how they put this in. Originally sideways offset didn't exist. But yeah, that would just be how you'd make third person camera automatically. Then there's camera tilt, which pretty much just affects, you know, the tilt. Kind of self-explanatory. There's also these new secondary things like tracking responsiveness, ground height, track ground height, look ahead. I think if you turn off track ground height, you can, like, you know, go through the puppet or whatever. I'm gonna have to change the camera. It's kind of in a weird state right now. yeah, all that stuff in there is pretty good. Avoid collision. If you turn that off, it'll go through walls. This is all in the controller sensor. It's a nifty deal. Avoid ground. If you turn that off, you'll probably not be able to look well. Gotta make sure collision is on. I think avoid ground, if you just turn that off, you can look under the puppet. There's also transition time, which affects how quickly your puppet's camera adjusts. Like if you're really far away and then you clip back to the puppet, that's affected by transition time. Like say if I had a camera, we'll go ahead and give it a little test. Cut, and you know, we've got a camera looking at a distant object. How quick will it return to the puppet when it's done? And that's how quick. Now if you turn transition time up, you'll get a very slow returning camera fade back to your little fellow. I would not advise that, except in extremely rare circumstances. It just isn't very pleasant from a player control perspective. But yeah, this is pretty much all the stuff you could ever want with controls. Acceleration time for camera, deceleration time, pitch minimum, you know, auto level, all this stuff, you know. It's as easy as pulling an output. I think you can even connect stuff to power it on. I could try that. Let me take a look at this. I don't entirely know what that does, but you can do it. Anyway, I think I've pretty much gone into the basics. There's also this setting for motion controls, which I never use, because again, I never use motion controls. I will mention one little tiny insignificant detail, and that's if, I've covered this before in my doorways video, but if you're going to have a puppet moving between levels and doorways, I highly advise, if you want your two-way doorway to work, relabel this sensor to something other than its basic setting, like relabel it to player. I would also relabel the controller. Well, maybe don't do that. Relabel your controller sensor, though, to something else other than its basic setting. Otherwise, those two-way doorways are an iffy proposition. At least from what I remember. Maybe that's changed now with all the updates. But yeah, hopefully you found this helpful on how to configure your logic. You know, like how do I make R1 do this and that? How do I shut off inputs, you know, and all that? Hopefully you found that helpful. Here are the names of all of our lovely cult supporters. Many thanks to all of you. If you'd like to get your name in those credits, check the link in the description and head over to our coffee. You can become a cultist neophyte to become credited at the end of our video, or you can become an acolyte to gain early access to videos in addition to credit. Now, if you aren't in the mood for membership, you can always leave a one-time tip. If you enjoyed this video and are not already subscribed, consider hitting the subscribe button down below. And maybe give us a quick like, both options are free. Also, don't forget to ring the notification bell so you will always be notified when new videos come out. If you have any thoughts, questions, or suggestions, leave them in the comments section. Or if you just want to let out your pent-up rage, give us some smack talk. Until next time, goodbye.